One of the key issues facing EU citizens living in the UK is their lack of voting rights in general elections and referendums. Currently, EU nationals who are legally resident in the UK can vote in local and devolved elections but not in national ones. This means they have no say in who forms the UK government or in major decisions that affect their lives, such as Brexit. There are an estimated 3.4 million EU nationals with settled status in the UK, and a further 2.7 million with pre-settled status. These are people who have made their home in the UK, contributed to society and the economy, and paid taxes. Yet they are denied a voice in the democratic process that shapes their future. The Conservative government has argued that the right to vote in parliamentary elections should be restricted to British citizens and those with the closest historical links to the UK, such as Commonwealth citizens and Irish citizens. However, this argument ignores the fact that many EU citizens have lived in the UK for decades, have family ties and cultural connections, and identify as British. The government has also claimed that extending voting rights to EU citizens would be an attempt to rig the electorate to rejoin the EU by stealth. However, this claim is based on a false assumption that all EU citizens are pro-EU and would vote against the government's Brexit agenda. In reality, EU citizens have diverse views and opinions on a range of issues, just like any other group of voters. Moreover, the government's position is inconsistent with its own policy of seeking bilateral agreements with some EU member states to grant reciprocal voting rights to UK citizens living abroad. So far, the UK has negotiated voting agreements with Spain, Portugal, Luxembourg and Poland, meaning that citizens from these countries who arrived in the UK after December 31, 2020 will retain their right to vote in local elections. However, this leaves millions of other EU citizens without voting rights, creating a two-tier system that is unfair and discriminatory. Labour has a different vision for democracy and citizenship. The party is considering extending voting rights to some EU citizens living in the UK if it wins the next general election. The party is working on a package of proposals that would also include votes for 16 and 17-year-olds and reform of the electoral system. Labour's leader Sir Keir Starmer has said that it feels wrong that EU citizens living in the UK cannot vote in general elections. He has argued that if people make a contribution to this country, if they live here, there is an argument for having them involved in the democratic process. He has also said that he respects the rights of EU citizens who chose to make their home in the UK before the end of the Brexit transition period. Labour believes that extending voting rights to EU citizens would strengthen democracy, foster integration and social cohesion, and recognise the valuable role that EU citizens play in our society. Labour also believes that giving EU citizens a voice would help to heal some of the divisions and mistrust that Brexit has caused, and build a more inclusive and tolerant country. One of the key issues in the debate over the UK's relationship with the EU is the question of voting rights for EU citizens living in the UK. Currently, EU nationals who are legally resident in the UK can vote in local and devolved elections but not general elections. However, Labour is considering extending voting rights to some EU citizens living in the UK if the party wins the next general election. The party is working on a package of proposals, including votes for some EU nationals and 16 and 17-year-olds in general elections. In 2020, Labour's leader Sir Keir Starmer called for all EU nationals to be given full voting rights in the UK. But Labour said no final policy decisions had been made. What are the benefits and drawbacks of granting voting rights to EU citizens living in the UK for both sides? Let's take a look at some of the arguments for and against this proposal. On the one hand, supporters of extending voting rights to EU citizens living in the UK argue that it is a matter of fairness and democracy. They say that EU citizens who live, work, pay taxes and contribute to society in the UK should have a say in how the country is governed. They also point out that many EU citizens have strong ties to the UK, such as family, friends, and cultural connections, and that they deserve to have their voices heard and their interests represented. Moreover, They claim that giving EU citizens voting rights would strengthen the UK's relationship with the EU and foster a sense of belonging and integration among different communities. On the other hand, opponents of extending voting rights to EU citizens living in the UK contend that it is an attempt to rig the electorate and undermine British sovereignty. They say that the right to vote in parliamentary elections and choose the next UK government is rightly restricted to British citizens and those with the closest historical links to our country. They also argue that giving EU citizens voting rights would create a conflict of interest and loyalty, as they may vote for policies that favour their home countries or the EU over the UK's national interest. Furthermore, they assert that granting voting rights to EU citizens living in the UK would be unfair to UK citizens living in some EU countries who have lost their voting rights after Brexit. As we can see, there are pros and cons to both sides of this debate. Ultimately, it is up to the voters and politicians to decide what kind of democracy they want for the UK and what role they want EU citizens living in the UK to play in it.